Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jani.tv. You're watching Community Stars. Today I have a very special guest. He has worked at 3 large platform companies, including Microsoft, Google, and VMware. At Microsoft, he contributed to IE4 to IE6 and then worked on a very popular framework called WPF. And maybe this was the same time when I was at Microsoft, when I was an evangelist for WPF and Avalon. And then this person went on to work at Google, defined their IaaS strategy, and then co-created Kubernetes at Google. Finally built a startup that got acquired by VMware. And he was very, very critical in turning vSphere into a Kubernetes-driven control plane. By now, you know who I'm talking about. This is none other than Joe Beda. Joe, welcome to my show. I'm thrilled, honored, and I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. You're too kind. I'm really excited to see where our conversation takes us.
Absolutely. Joe, you know, it's not very often that you get to talk to someone who has influenced so many lives, whether it is IE6 at Microsoft, which was the de facto browser for a long time, and then GCE, followed by Kubernetes. Today there are like millions of deployments and so many engineers working on Kubernetes. And then, how you contributed to some of the open source projects like Velero, which is still the most preferred backup tool for Kubernetes. And then, of course, Project Pacific at VMware. So it's very exciting. So let's get started. I have some very interesting questions, maybe what the community wants to always ask you. So, Joe, you worked at 3 large companies. Some of those are like the biggest of our times. So in terms of culture, what do you see as the difference between Microsoft, Google, and VMware? And how does it influence and impact technology innovation?
Well, that's actually a really hard question to answer. And I think, there's 2 things that make that difficult. The first is that my position at these companies was very different. I mean, I joined Microsoft out of college. I interned there a couple of times. And when you're first starting out, you get a very different view of the organization, what makes it move, than when you're more senior, as I am now, or, as what my position was at VMware. And then the second thing is that even, within these companies, even like on the smaller side, like VMware compared to like a Microsoft or a Google as it is now, there is no one culture. I think there is this culture that sort of pervades the, from the top down or the founding principles. But, groups tend to actually evolve and have their own cultures and their own way of working. And so a lot of times when folks are saying, hey, what do you think about working at this company or that company? It's actually highly group dependent. Some groups are great, some groups aren't. It really depends on the people that you're working with. So for me, I think there are definitely organizational wide drivers and cultural things in terms of getting stuff moving. But more than anything else, I think the smaller group that you're in has a much larger impact in terms of whether you're going to be successful or not. But that being said, I think that there is, a theory I have around company culture where I really think that it's a sort of caricature of the character flaws of the founders. And I don't know what this says about Heptio, so I'm not going to dig too deep into it. But I think, Microsoft early on when I was there, you'd hear stories about people who'd go into meetings with Bill Gates. And, Bill's super smart, successful guy, but he was not a nice person. And, it's not unusual for people to evaluate whether that meeting was successful or not based on the number of F-bombs that Bill dropped on you, right? And so this sort of hard charging, how do you not drown in the rain type of reaction that people, that you would see that the lieutenants, the next level up, would try and both emulate and outdo Bill at being Bill. And that ended up setting the culture for a lot of Microsoft in the early days. It really was this hyper aggressive type of environment. And I got more stories than that. I think it's mellowing now with Satya there, but like there is a core of minds deep that still thinks that, berating people and, public humiliation is the way to get stuff done. Now you compare and contrast that to Google. where I was in meetings with Larry and Sergey, and they'd get bored, they'd start throwing bits of paper at each other, and then Eric Schmidt would be there going like, "Hey guys, pay attention, this is important," and so this level of if you don't like something, ignore it and it'll go away. That ideal permeates permeates Google, and it's something that you'll see that in terms of their product strategy, like they'll launch things, and then they'll lose interest and just sort of hope it goes away, right? And so there is sort of a fundamental passive aggressiveness to Google. Now, I should also preface it by saying this is all my experience around this stuff. So, and then VMware, I think, VMware is an older company. The impact of the founders is not so much. I think it's a kind engineering driven company from what I saw, but it's also, I think, I think it's also struggling to actually keep up with sort of the pace and the types of things that are happening in the industry now. And when I joined VMware, Pat was CEO. As part of coming as Heptio, there were definitely a lot of discussions there, and got to know him a little bit. And I think he conceptualizes himself as an engineer, even though like the dude was amazing with customers. Like there was one early meeting where he came in carrying a cake, singing happy birthday at one of the leaders in the meeting, right? Like the customer meeting, right? So he was a schmoozer, but also I think he viewed himself as an engineer, and I really wish him a lot of success at Intel. But that idea of engineering as central is something that is core to VMware's culture. But then you compare and contrast that to sort of like the Dell EMC sort of sales machine. And I think there is a little bit of culture clash and sort of struggle for identity within VMware that is on hold with the Broadcom acquisition, but is definitely something that you'll see there also. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully it got at what you were looking for.
No, that's very useful. And most of what you said is what I heard personally from people worked in all these companies. So Joe, tell us about your entry to VMware and, basically from Heptio to VMware. How was your first conversation with Pat? How was it like? How did you convince VMware to invest in something like Kubernetes and converge containers with VMs? It's culturally very different for VMware.
Well, they were already down this path when they acquired Heptio. So I think, the first meeting with Pat, we had been in discussions for a while, and there's a lot, these acquisitions take a sort of twisty path to come to fruition. But the first meeting with Pat, me and Craig flew down to the Bay Area, and we were gating in an Uber to go there. And then the Uber got pulled over by a cop, and we were going to be late. And the poor guy was getting a ticket. And so we had to call another Uber to where our Uber was so that we could get to the meeting on time. But that's probably not what you're asking. I think, Pat, I think VMware rightly recognized that, they'd gotten kicked in the teeth a little bit with the vCloud Air stuff, right? This idea of like, hey, we can compete with the big boys with respect to cloud. And the honest answer is hardly anybody can compete with the big boys with respect to cloud. It's the amount of money and resources that it takes to build a true cloud is truly staggering. And I saw that firsthand from the point of view of GCP. And so I think, from a strategy point of view, this idea of like, how do we do something that gets us closer to the developer, that starts to engage modern IT, right? Where it's not just sort of managing VMs and throw it over the wall and ticket queues, but how do we provide this more fine-grained cloud-like experience? I think it made a lot of sense, and they were already going down that path. And I think the fact that with Heptio, we had some success being able to speak enterprise. We had some big banks, for example, as early customers, signed some big deals. That got VMware's attention and definitely made them more interested in us, because not only were we up on this technology and really central to this thing that seems to have legs, we also, could actually relate to real enterprises doing real work. And I think that combination is really rare. And you'll often see in our industry these startups that do amazing stuff, but you look at it through the eyes of an enterprise and you're like, there's no way that this is going to have huge penetration in enterprise because of these like long list of blocking issues. And maybe they can work on those things, but it's a lot of work to be able to get to the point where you can really service enterprises and where you can really, get on the radar of the CIO and become a strategic bet for that company. And so, so I think it was our combination of being able to bridge those worlds that made us interesting to VMware.
Right. So as they say, rest is history. And today, I think vSphere has hit 8.x. This is completely baked. Now it's a part of the DNA, so which is phenomenal. Now, shifting gears, Joe, did you really anticipate the kind of success that Kubernetes has enjoyed in the community when it was internally launched and when it was being discussed at Google?
I mean, it's odd. It's easy to come up with lots of ideas and delusions of grandeur of like, this could be huge, right? I mean, as you sit around with, a couple of beers and some friends and you can come up with 12 of these. And so there was a point early on in Kubernetes where this idea of open source, community, getting people rallied around something in common, it occurred to, I think, me and Brendan and Craig that this was a possibility and we could actually go there. The fact that it actually happened, honestly, takes me by surprise. So it's one of these things where we saw the possibility early on, and it was something that we were working for. And I think if you look at our early interactions around open sourcing it, inviting, knowing that we would write Kubernetes and people would run it on Amazon and that would be competitive with GCP, like we knew all that from the get-go. And yet we still did it because we wanted to build that community. We wanted to build that movement. We wanted to build something akin to the Linux kernel or the LAMP stack or what have you in a way that would give, Google a fighting chance, Google Cloud a fighting chance. So the strategy was there. The fact that it actually played out a lot, more than we even thought, I think was a huge surprise.
Absolutely. So I was actually there when it got announced at one of the Google Cloud Next events. It was called GCP Next or whatever, the very first conference that Google Cloud has hosted. So it's astounding success, the way Kubernetes has moved from where it was in 2014, 2015 to where it is today. Extending that, Joe, do you think Google has regrets about open sourcing it and just leaving it in the wild to let competition pick it up and make more money out of it?
Well, when you say, does Google have regrets, I think it's a question of who at Google, right? Because Google is not a singular entity. I think there are definitely leaders in Google that are, I think, and I think there are definitely people who have regrets around it. I think that they are imagining a world that would not have existed. Like Kubernetes without open source would not be Kubernetes, right? If Google had released Kubernetes and kept it as a proprietary SaaS product, similar to say, ECS at Amazon, right? It would have been interesting, but it would not have changed the game. And so I think there's a certain, rethinking of history that I think happens with some of those folks around thinking that, they could both have the huge success and uptake of Kubernetes and keep it close to the vest and something that's proprietary to GCP. And that choice just wasn't in the cards. And so, yeah, I think that there's also, and this is something that, I've seen across multiple companies, as you look at enterprises, is that there's one mindset, and this is very much driven by the public markets, where it's a business unit's job to deliver monotonically increasing revenue quarter over quarter, right? This is ultimately what the big businesses develop into. And that is my background's flickering here. I apologize. That's ultimately, the job of a lot of people within these companies is to provide that predictable revenue because that's what the markets demand. Innovation doesn't work like that. The reality is that when you're doing something new, when you're establishing new markets and new products, revenue is a trailing indicator. And so what you find is that engagement, excitement, community participation, number of customers versus value of those customers. Those are all early indicators, right? Do you want to have 1,000 customers paying you $1, or do you have one customer paying you $1,000, right? And I think that for innovators, you want to have 1,000 customers paying you $1 because there's so much more growth potential there versus just concentrating on the big deals. Whereas you see a lot of incumbent companies focus on the big deals. And so I think that managers that came into Google with that sort of Oracle mindset, right? We're looking for that monotonically increasing revenue quarter over quarter, and Kubernetes was a long-term play to be able to deliver that. And there's a lot of places where, you know, connecting the effort to the revenue is you can reason your way through it, but it's not as direct a connection of like, well, this sales guy went out and actually made a big sale, right? And so a lot of sort of traditional enterprise managers struggle with that more tenuous connection between effort and outcome. But I believe it, and I think it's important.
Absolutely. So, Joe, one of the most visible a trend is every cloud provider offering a managed Kubernetes. You know, everyone has their own flavor of Kubernetes. So how do you think these cloud providers can differentiate and offer something that is unique to their platform? Because everyone has the same upstream Kubernetes. And of course, they're building extensions like, Cloud Run, which is very proprietary, and then app containers, the container apps, or the app runners, whatever you call. So my concern, as someone who enjoys the portability, the standardization, and the Kubernetes API is this market is getting fragmented. So my question is of twofold. One is, how do you see this differentiating factor evolving? Number one. Number two, what do you think of this fragmentation and proprietary black boxes being built on top of Kubernetes?
So, I mean, what I would say is that the language around, proprietary or extensions or value add goes hand in hand with, discussions around things like lock-in, right? And I think anytime people are talking about clouds and multi-clouds, how locked in are you to that particular platform? And there is a tug of war between customers who wanted to, maintain a certain degree of flexibility, versus the platform providers that want you so dependent on them that you have no other choices. And we've seen this play itself out over and over again across our industry, across time, and probably across other industries too. I think, part of the struggle here is that a lot of people view lock-in as a binary yes or no purity test type of thing. And that's not how I see it. I see this as a risk mitigation point of view, right? If you're getting enough value from the platform that you're willing to actually take on dependencies, then that's, a risk that you're going to take. And so I think the question is, what is going to be the expense and the effort and the timeline for divorcing a partner, for divorcing a vendor, right? If you want to move from AWS to GCP or vice versa or whatever, is that a rewrite your application 3-year effort? Or is that, do a bunch of tooling and testing 6-month effort with an operations team? And I think that that's something that businesses can make a choice about, right? You're taking a risk there in terms of how in bed with, how locked in are you going to be? And there's rational choices across the spectrum there. My advice to customers, and I think one of the things with the conformance work that's been, going on for a long time in Kubernetes is that it's okay for folks to do proprietary extensions to Kubernetes, to do add-ons. Some of the times this is going to be, excuse me, I got to sneeze. No, I'm not going to sneeze. I just think I'm going to sneeze. Oftentimes this will be, things that layer on top of Kubernetes, like dashboards or deployment stuff. Sometimes it'll be underlying things like Fargate or ACI or whatever Google's calling their autopilot-y thing, right? But the idea, in my mind is that if you're going outside of standard Kubernetes, we want that to be obvious and auditable so that you can actually go into that trade-off around, hey, am I taking a dependency on something that's proprietary? Is it worthwhile? We want that to be something that folks can go in eyes open versus accidentally starting to rely on features that you're not realizing that you're relying on. Now, I'm not sure that we're there. I think, there definitely have been some push and pull there, but that was the idea there, that these proprietary extensions are not evil. they're not good. They just are. But we want users to be able to make informed choices around the risk sort of profiles that make sense for them.
Right. Absolutely. So I have another technical question. So KubeVirt is getting a lot of attention and a lot of adoption among enterprises. They are essentially looking at that as the mechanism to bring containers and VMs under the fold of Kubernetes. So as someone who has seen this transformation at VMware, of infusing Kubernetes API into vSphere, what do you think is the fundamental difference, technical difference between KubeVirt versus vSphere with Kubernetes APIs?
Yeah, I think where we're at right now with Kubernetes and vSphere, now I may be a little bit disconnected because I haven't worked for VMware for a little bit now, is that more than anything else, we were looking at Kubernetes as a new type of API layer for vSphere. And I think this is one of those things that I think, as I came into VMware was surprising to me is that, I helped design, I started Google Compute Engine and designed the early API for GCE. And I understood, what does a VM API look like for the cloud? And then you go into vSphere and you're like, where is it? And it doesn't really exist, not in the form of like, hey, you download an SDK, you can write Terraform against it or whatever, or you can like program and dynamically spin stuff up and down, configure everything from the network down to the VM to storage, all with one consistent API. What you end up with, with vSphere is that maybe you have an API for vSphere, but that's different than the API for, maybe there's a little bit of extended stuff for the storage layer. But if you want to start programming NSX, well, it's which version of NSX and totally different APIs, because it's still based on this model of like, if you want to make network changes, you file a ticket with the network team, versus in cloud, if you want to make network changes, you call an API, right? And so there's a fundamental sort of disconnect there that, we were working on, that I was helping the vSphere team with. Now, like I advised mostly on that stuff. I wasn't the ones driving it. Of like, how do we start layering on a modern API consistent experience on top of vSphere as it exists today? And that was really, a big part of Project Pacific there, along with things like, the containers and VMs and stuff. But for me, I think the most critical thing there was a consistent modern API surface area for vSphere, which is something that I think we're starting to see emerge out of that. That truly makes it a private cloud from the point of view of a developer. And so, yeah, I think, so that's one thing. The other thing is that the virtualization infrastructure with vSphere, everything from ESX to the way that VMs are scheduled on a single machine, to the way that you monitor and update this stuff, and the ecosystem of partners around things that you can plug in and hardware acceleration of this and that and the other, like that's vast. And if you look at something like KubeVirt, like you can do a lot with sort of, Linux virtualization, but there's a long tail to get to the level of sophistication that you get with something like vSphere. And so what I look at is something like KubeVirt. The architecture there actually reminds me a lot of how we built GCE on top of Borg. So for those not aware, Borg is Google's internal container scheduling system. A lot of the experience of Borg inspired Kubernetes, but there's not a lot, if any, shared code between the two. But the way that we built GCE on top of Borg was very similar to KubeVirt. You schedule a job. Inside that job, you run a KVM QEMU process that runs the VM, and then you do virtual networking on top of that. So that's essentially how we built GCE. So I understand that. But let's take, one of the premier features of vSphere, right? vMotion, right? The ability to live migrate a VM from one host to another. This allows you to essentially do zero to low downtime on an actual machine, which is very enterprise friendly because, building systems that stay up as individual machines come and go is a whole different ball of wax versus running a monolith on a VM and moving the VM around. That's a premier feature of vSphere. Doing that with KVM and QEMU and Kubernetes, not impossible, but holy moly, that's a lot of work, right? And so I think that, so the question here is do you need sort of the gold-plated standard that is vSphere around virtualization, or do you need something that's going to be by nature a little more rough and ready, maybe not as optimized, maybe without all the features, which is what you're going to get with KubeVirt. And I think what we might be finding is that a lot of folks don't need, all of the features of vSphere to be able to do some interesting stuff. And so that's where there's room for something like KubeVirt to really start to be effective.
Fascinating. So Project Pacific is beyond kubectl get VMs. It is getting the heritage of vSphere and vCenter and merging that with the best of Kubernetes. And KubeVirt is actually more like,
the way I describe Pacific is I think it's actually three things, and a lot of this stuff goes through the marketing machine at big companies, and you have to sort of make do with what you have. But Project Pacific is essentially three things. It's a new API surface area for vSphere. It's the ability to have containers run inside of VMs in a highly optimized way, in a way that's sort of, it's not a true, compliant Kubernetes cluster, but it's something that makes sense for vSphere itself, and the ability, through TKG, the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, to spin up new clusters easily on top of vSphere. And so you add those things together, and that was the experience that we're aiming for with Project Pacific.
Perfect. And that brings me to another logical question, which is an extension of this. Just like VMs and containers kind of converged, there is, again, a lot of discussion around WebAssembly, Wasm, and Kubernetes getting integrated with Wasm. So what's your take on that? I'm confused, and it's almost like going back to LXC all over again and figuring out how CRI works, how OCI evolved, and now we are back to square one with something very proprietary, Wasm, and now we are building an interface for that through CRI and making sure Kubernetes can talk to Wasm. So is it not like going back to the whiteboard all over again?
I mean, this is a place where I have to be careful. So I was talking actually to a venture capitalist here in Seattle about the Wasm space yesterday, and I'll give you my opinion, but also I want to note that, I have history here. And so maybe there's some parts of this that I'm not seeing. So, but I'm with you. I think it's a bit of a head scratcher. I think that from a technology point of view, Wasm is very interesting. And what I'll say is that when we look at portable runtimes, right, we have things like the CLR or the JVM, but we also have things like Ruby or Python or Lua, right? These are all sort of portable runtimes to some degree. And what we see is that, with the CLR and a little bit of the JVM, you have essentially runtimes that are multi-language and a certain degree of portable also, especially the CLR was designed to be multi-language. The JVM evolved that way. Whereas you have something like Python and Ruby, their runtimes are part and parcel of the language. Those things are intertwined. On the other end, so that's sort of like the runtime up to the developer through the language mechanisms. The other end is like, how does that runtime connect to the underlying system that it's working through? This, for lack of a better word, I'll call this the syscall interface. What are the set of toys and tools that are available to the application, to the workload to talk outside the runtime? And what we find across a lot of these technologies is that, especially let's take the JVM. It's Java, it's the JVM, Java the language, JVM the runtime, and the set of libraries and bindings to underlying services for files and network and all the other stuff that you need to do to make this work. Which, now let's take another language like Lua. So Lua is often embedded in everything from game engines to, databases, right? I mean, I don't think they stuck with it, but the original extension mechanism for BigQuery at Google was Lua. They were playing around with that, for example, right? The interesting thing about Lua is that it's a portable runtime in language, but it also is agnostic and doesn't have predefined sort of a syscall interface. And so you can embed it in something and give it a very sort of refined thing that it can call. What's interesting about Wasm is that it's a runtime, that's not bound to a language and not bound to a syscall interface. And so from a technology point of view, factoring these things out cleanly so you have the runtime that's defactored from these other aspects, both above and below, I think is technically very, very interesting. The question is, where does this change the game for customers? Now, if you're doing embedded things or super constrained runtime environments, so I think about something like Cloudflare and their workers where you want to run lightweight things across, tons of edge locations, you're not going to necessarily be spinning up VMs or containers there. You could, but like the capacity and the expense there probably doesn't pencil out. If you need a runtime for extending, say, stored procedures on a database, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think, I'm looking at, there's databases out there, and the name of the one I'm thinking about is escaping me right now, where they were evolved in the Java era, and the way that you extend, and do stored procedures is that you upload a jar, right? And it's like, we look at that now through modern eyes and you're like, not everybody's going to write Java, right? There are interesting things being done without Java. Uploading a JVR seems stupid, right? It makes that database feel like an anachronism. Whereas if it was like upload a Wasm bundle, you're like, okay, that's something that feels future-proof and language agnostic. So that makes a ton of sense there. So I think that there's sort of embedded environments that make sense. I think Wasm in the browser, super interesting, right? But in terms of Wasm getting to the point where it's going to be able to run more traditional enterprise applications, and again, this is crossing that chasm to something where people are going to pay real money and it's actually going to be the backbone for an enterprise. I think we're a ways away from these constrained runtimes being able to work, in that environment, right? For people who are writing Spring apps, are they going to go through and actually somehow retarget on top of Wasm? And so it's like, okay, if you want to write Rust, it's a great runtime for Rust. That's portable. That's great. But also you can write Rust and put it in a container, and it's not that hard either. It's faster in terms of instantiation, but you still, if you want to give it an IP address, you still have to allocate that IP address, which often ends up being the long pole when you're spinning up, a VM or a container. Or you can say, hey, it doesn't have an IP address. It has some sort of like virtualized interfaces that are faster to allocate. Well, now you have a non-standard runtime environment, and it's hard to adapt existing applications to that thing. And so there's a lot of sort of trade-offs to be made there. And I don't get the feeling that Wasm fundamentally changes the game in that part of the segment of the industry. It feels like it's an incremental improvement versus a revolutionary type of improvement. And it comes with pros and cons, right? You have to recompile your stuff for a different target. You can't rely on certain things in the file system that you might want to rely on. Now, that being said, what I think we're seeing happen in the Wasm world is that I said that syscall interface is largely undefined. There's efforts to standardize on sort of profiles of syscalls that you can actually import. This is I believe the WAGI stuff is, I'm not an expert in it, so I may be getting some of these details wrong, and I apologize to the audience if I am. But that idea of we want to provide richer and richer runtimes for applications, richer and richer sets of syscalls, I think that idea has legs. And I think doing WAGI and Wasm is one way to do it. But also, if you look at something like Dapper running on top of Kubernetes, it's also a way to start providing a richer toolkit to applications in terms of sort of an expanded syscall interface. Now, it's going to be more efficient with Wasm calling through WAGI to these things, because with something like Dapper, you're doing, some sort of local host loopback type of connection to to another process running in the same pod. But that idea of we're taking things that used to be built into applications and compiled in, we're taking that, we're extracting that out, putting it beside the other side of an API, whether it be a language binding API or a network API. And that way we can rev and evolve and do that stuff separately from the stuff that's, statically linked. It's essentially an interesting evolving, aspect of, say, dynamic linking, right? Is now we move from dynamic linking being sort of DLLs or to something that is at the other side of some sort of boundary, whether that be a network or runtime boundary.
Right, absolutely. So I think eventually when we look at the Kubernetes landscape, when we run a kubelet on a Raspberry Pi Zero or a microcontroller, replacing that with a crustlet based on Wasm makes a lot of sense. So I think it's going to bring in some kind of a heterogeneous interface, particularly onboarding highly resource constrained microcontrollers and single board computers. I think that's where Wasm has a lot of merit, and interoperating between these, particularly, VMs on one side, containers on the other side, the regular node pool, and then onboarding microcontrollers and highly constrained compute environments like Edge with Wasm. It covers the entire spectrum. I think that's going to be a very interesting landscape to look at. All right. So Joe, now I'm going to shift into something called the rapid fire round. So I'm going to ask you questions where I want you to answer in one line.
I'm bad at that, but we'll see how I do.
So, what is that one thing that you expect to see in the cloud native ecosystem in next 12 months?
I think a continued focus on supply chain and managing artifacts is going to be super interesting. And I think it's just part of selling to mature enterprises, especially in light of cybersecurity mandates coming from government. I think that was one very long sentence.
Okay, now another very interesting one. So what's that one-liner that kind of sealed the deal between Heptio and VMware?
The most important thing for me as we were selling Heptio to VMware was that we got good alignment with respect to our values so that I could stay true to the people that we brought on board. And looking at the set of values that VMware has and the way that we've been running Heptio, it seemed like those things really lined up.
Perfect. And I know you have worked on a variety of platforms, languages for the last three and a half decades. So what's your favorite programming language as a geek?
Oh, man. I really enjoy Go. And the primary reason, and it's so stupid, is Go format. This idea that you write code, you hit save, it formats, nobody argues about indentation or tabs or spaces. It just removes a huge distraction from it. And I think it helps me to be able to move fast with Go.
Awesome. Totally. So do you prefer an operator or a Helm chart if you are building a custom workload deployment tool for Kubernetes?
I think that they're apples and oranges. I'm not a huge fan of Helm, and I can go into reasons there. I think it's too coupled, but also I don't think you need an active component running all the time, which is what an operator implies. So I think that there's other ways to think about packaging and installation that may use active code that sits in the middle between Helm and operators.
Makes sense. Totally. Having built GCE from the ground up, what do you think is the key differentiator between other IaaS platforms like Azure VMs and EC2?
I think at this point, a lot of the major features have converged to the point where there's not a lot of differences there. But and I haven't used a lot of this stuff in a while, but one of the things is because we built GCE on top of Borg, and Borg is very dynamic in terms of the way things are scheduled, the dynamism in terms of configuration that GCE has, I think, is still ahead. You can do custom machine shapes where you can pick the number of CPUs and RAM. You can do dynamic allocation of things like SSDs or TPUs. And a lot of that is based on a lot of the deep, really fascinating technical systems that Google has built, both software and hardware. There's a talk and paper out recently talking about using optical mirror, like micro mirror arrays, the same things used in projectors, these DLP chips, for doing switching across the optical switching across the Google data center fabric. And so things like that are just amazing. It enables features that it's very difficult for the other cloud providers to match.
Absolutely. My favorite feature of GCE is custom configuration. And I don't think any other cloud provider gives you that slider to drag to define how many number of vCPUs and how much memory you want. I think that's been a key differentiator. That's one of the key reasons why, GCE is preferred by a lot of customers. And I think the second one, which took a lot of time for the competition to catch up, was read-only block storage. Attaching the same persistent disk. That was a big deal back then.
Yeah, well, and that was something that just fell out of our sort of our implementation, to be honest, that we were able to do that. And so I'm like, all right, let's make that happen, because that seems like a differentiating feature.
Right. And now, shifting gears, you have been to India multiple times. What's your favorite Indian food?
This is part of the problem, is that, anytime you're an American traveling in a foreign country, it's hard for the names to stick in my brain, right? And that's my problem. That's not anybody else's problem, right? What I do know is I love South Indian cuisine, and part of what I love there is, like, there's some places in the world you go, like, and like, what is this? I don't know. Am I eating something that I don't want to eat? No, but like you can eat anything in South India as long as, it's not fresh fruit and you're with unclean water. And it's just amazing. Right. So I love that. I'm not afraid of spice. So every time I've been to India, I love spicy food. I always surprise my colleagues by saying, yeah, I'll eat that.
Nice.
The one thing that I've had trouble with is, like, y'all put masala in everything. And like masala Coke was just too much for me. I'm like, I do not need super sweet Coke with masala spices. I just couldn't do it.
And do you get to watch Indian movies, particularly Bollywood?
Oh God, I was going to look this up before our interview here. There was one time when I was visiting some colleagues when I was at Google, and I want to make sure I get it right. Okay. So we went out to the movies and saw this Bollywood film, and so I'm not a huge Bollywood fan, but it was in 2010, and it was in Thiran, robot with Shankar, right? And it was all in Tamil.
Okay.
And there were no subtitles, so I didn't understand a damn thing. But it was, but you go to those things for the spectacle, right? Because it's just so over the top, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. So that's my as far as I go with Bollywood.
Amazing. You will actually get a lot of fans, because Rajnikant is like a demigod, the hero who played Robo in that movie. So
yeah. So I'm sorry, Rajnikant. Yeah. I'm butchering his name.
Excellent.
I apologize, but yeah. And I think it's hilarious because you look at him and he's not like a Hollywood action star. He's just, he looks like a regular guy, but he pulls it off. It's amazing.
Absolutely. He has a lot of fans, and he's a demigod to most of us. Excellent. So finally, Joe, this is something that, everyone is waiting to hear, and a lot of people wanted me to ask you this. So what's next for Joe Beda?
I don't know, to be honest. And so I think, when I left VMware, I was honestly pretty burned out, and I didn't want to look at a computer for like 6 months, and I'm slowly getting back into it. I've taken on some hobbies. I'm interested in, like, it's so funny. It's like we work with software, high level systems. It's all very conceptual. I want to understand some of what's going on under the covers. And so I love the evolving accessibility of so much of the underlying technologies, whether it be, being able to design your own circuit boards, doing microcontroller stuff. I've been playing around with 3D printers, understanding motion systems and drivers, and that stuff I find fascinating. I don't know if that's going to turn into anything, but it's the hobby that I'm working through, one of the hobbies I'm working through right now. I think, for me personally, I think when you leave something, you got to give yourself time to sort of deprogram before you figure out what the next thing is. And I'm lucky enough now that whatever my next thing is, it doesn't have to be cloud. It doesn't have to be even in the tech industry. I have, colleagues and friends that have, left and started doing clean energy work. Right. So I'm trying to figure out, where do I want to spend my time? Something that'll really motivate me. And in the meantime, spending a lot of time with the family. Some of them are more excited about that than others. And really finding time to decompress. So I don't know where things are going to take me, to be honest.
But, the most interesting fact is it all starts like a hobby, then it becomes passion, then it becomes obsession, and you end up building something very, very exciting. So we are eagerly looking forward to it. We know something very interesting is lined up.
Oh, give me some time.
But Joe, it's always fun talking to you. You provide so many insights, and you have seen so much of this evolution in the last 3 decades. So it's fantastic. This is going to be one of the fun shows on my channel. So thanks again for joining. It's an honor to talk to you and have you on my show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm going to do a follow-up with you on many other things. Like I want to touch upon eBPF and, some of the other evolving technologies. So I'll reach out to you for a follow-up discussion.
Maybe we can find some time and make that work.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much.